there seems to be some sort of a tacit blueprint to this. But the way it happens is in a sequence. It started from Gaza, and then it's spreading when the momentum is moving away from Gaza. Not all the activities, but the momentum. We see this from the fact that the northern Gaza is now under heavy bombardment. And I don't think that these are military assets alone. I think that from the beginning of the war, there has been an effort to create an area of cushion, if you will. And that goes to cut the area of Gaza even smaller and smaller. It's cut by 1,000 cuts. Now, if you can handle this and then move to the next theater of war, as the military observers call it, in a sequence, it's easier than waging these wars in parallel. But it hasn't happened in sequence, and it hasn't happened exactly in parallel. It's been a dirty war in that sense as well. Netanyahu cabinet, of course, has said from the beginning that Israel has a right to defend itself. It has a responsibility to defend itself. That's absolutely true. Both the right and the responsibility. But that doesn't seem to be the question, really, because then the question becomes, what about the Palestinians? Do they have a right and responsibility to defend themselves? And I think that they do. What about the Lebanese? What about the Yemen? What about Iranians, and so on and so forth? This is a very strange situation where it's hard for me to see that any other country could achieve the same objectives that Israel has so far done without international sanctions, without international intervention. And that takes us back to the role of the great powers, the role of the United States and a few other countries. There seems to be a tacit subtext to this. If you defend yourself against Israel, we see that the hostile action, and we will punish you. And that doesn't seem to be something that a credible broker would do in this kind of a situation. So I don't see this as an asset to US objectives in the Middle East. It may be that in the short term, from purely military point of view, but that point of view has never created peace. And that's why I think we are where we are. At least I argue in the book that what we see right now is the result of 50 years of failed military diplomacy in the region, mainly by the US because it has such a major influence in the area. But the problems themselves go back to the ethnic expulsions from late 1940s to the present.
Who's responsible for this failure? Is the neocons in the United States? Is the Israeli lobby in the United States? The Israeli government, who has a lot of leverage on Washington? How do you find the balance of power when it comes to the Middle East?
That was a question I posed to myself when I started writing the book. And I tried all kinds of pathways to reach an explanation via an Occam's razor, if you will. Explanation that would be concise and simple, and yet comprehensive enough to give me a general idea of what's going on here and why is it so difficult to move ahead. And why is it that things seem to be getting worse, even though we're talking about the countries that have got the bulk, most of the US economic and military aid in the past 50 years. And prior to that, the role of Britain, the role of France, and other great powers in the region. So in the fall of Israel, I went back to the idea of there being four major structural forces that account for a series of cumulative disasters in the Middle East. I call them the Great Conjuncture, because I don't think that it's a perfect storm. Perfect storms are possible in mathematics. We humans are imperfect, so we create imperfect storms, and this might be one of those. But it is a confluence of different kinds of forces. And I think that the key trigger in all of this has been the waves of Palestinian expulsions since the late 1947s. This precedes the state of Israel and creation, 1948. Whichever way one looks at this crisis, one always comes back to this. Even I personally wasn't aware of the full weight of this factor until the 1980s, when the so-called Israeli new historians were able to access the declassified files in Israel and take another look at the past history. Prior to that, though, Palestinian historians had made it very clear that these expulsions happened, but they had been ignored to a large extent. Why? Because they didn't have the kind of voice that the historians of a sovereign nation would have. And they were considered to be partial, not academic enough, not knowledgeable enough. But they had a point because they had access to people who suffered the bulk of these expulsions, the Palestinians. On the Israeli side, historians like Benny Morris was able to show how critically the events of 1948 have to do with what goes on in the present. The son, ex-member of Shin Bet, I think, Israeli security, and accomplished soldier himself, the son of Moshe Shareb, the first foreign minister of Israel, used to call it the original crime, these expulsions. And I think that one really has to go back to that far to understand what is going on here. The second aspect of this all, and if I may add, with the expulsions, I think really it was the work of Ilan Pappé around 20 years ago. His work made it very clear that it was not just the net effects of war, as Benny Morris would have it. He pointed out that in war, bad things happen. Ilan Pappé was able to show that there were objectives, there were intentions, there were collectives actively creating these goals early on, 1930s and 40s. And I talk about those a lot in the book. Let's keep in mind also what happens right now. One reason why the hammering of North Gaza is escalating may be that there is an increasing feeling within Israel that this area could be ground zero for a new kind of Jewish settlements. Those that left 2005 can now come back. Certainly among the settlers, this is a great hope. I consider it something very different. Now, second aspect of the Great Juncture, if you will, would be the excessive expansion of these Jewish settlements in the Palestinian occupied territories. This started already in the late 60s under the Labour government, if I may add. And that, I think, was one of the greatest mistakes that the Labour government did in its first decade after the Six-Day War. My dear friend, whose books I once translated, Amos Oz, the great novelist, called them the neo-Nazis already in 1967. There were others who saw quite clearly where this would take people. Yael Dayan, the daughter of General Moshe Dayan, whom I met around 1973, and who was then already active in peace movement and later became one of the peace activists, just as Amos Oz became the co-founder of Peace Now, a movement that I've supported ever since then. They saw what was coming, and other Israelis as well, but they couldn't stop it when the government allowed it to happen. There was a so-called Yigal Allon plan that aimed still at national security, and the hope was that there would be some kind of a settlement, two-state solution, if you will. But somehow that was ignored, because on the one hand, there was this talk about Allon plan, but it was never taken forward by the Israelis, and it had a lot of aspects that would have not been agreeable to many Arab countries and certainly to Palestinians. But at least there was an effort to that direction. Things changed dramatically with the election of 1977 when the Likud government, what I called hard right or harsh right, came into power. Now, this is not your normal right-wing movement. Of course, there were elements of free trade, free markets, and so on and so forth. And they had, in some areas, certain points. The Labour government had allowed too many monopolies, not enough competition, not enough market-led initiatives. But these constraints were turned upside down. When this government came in, this cabinet came in by Menachem Begin, what we saw was, on the one hand, the rise of neoconservative economic policies, but on the other hand, a very aggressive state-led effort to support these Jewish settlements. So much so that in the early 1980s, some people, like the deputy mayor of Jerusalem at the time, Ben Veniste, said that have we reached the point of irreversibility? Are there so many settlers in the West Bank that we can no longer reverse the course of history? We have to live with this. The reality is that those settlements could be removed. They were removed in 2005. They could be removed now. That's a political issue.